Unit 1, Knowing Who's Disabled.
Hello, lovely to meet you. I'm Christina Welsh and I work for the Council for Disabled Children. If you haven't yet watched the introduction video, please find the link in the text below, as it will provide a guide as to how to approach the 4 units in the training series. This is Unit 1, Knowing Who's Disabled. An important part of making adjustments for young disabled children requires an understanding of who may be disabled under the Equality Act. This is often not well understood, and the definition is broad, so we'll take some time to unpack it and offer examples. It's also important to understand the relationship between special educational needs, disability, and medical needs, as these can overlap but also can be distinct groups as well. We will use this as an opportunity for you to reflect on who may be disabled in your setting, and how you might know or reasonably suspect. And the final element is about how to have open, trusting conversations with parents and carers about their disabled child, and putting a collective plan in place to support them in the setting. Before we begin, pause for a moment and think about the children you work with. Are there any who might be facing barriers that haven't been named or might not be recognised as a disability? This will be really important thinking about going ahead in the unit.
This first unit is designed to help you understand the definition of disability in the Equality Act and what that means for the children you work with. We'll help you to consider the relationship between special educational needs, disability and medical needs, how they overlap and how they may be discrete groups. We'll also encourage you to reflect on who may be disabled in your setting, and help you to build the confidence to have open conversations with parents and carers about disability. What may you ask? How may you approach them? We've taken some recommendations from parents and carers themselves. Throughout the training, when we refer to parents, we include parents, carers, and those with parental responsibility. So who knows who could be disabled? In many cases, you may not know, but you will have lots of information that you will need to use to find out. So a question to you. Nationally, what percentage of children do you think may count as disabled? Is it A, 5.3%, B, 7%, C, 9%, D, 11%, E, 14.2%, F, 19.5%, G, 24%, or H, other? Take a moment to pause the recording and have a think about the options. So which one did you choose? Did you have another percentage you wanted to throw into the mix? The answer to this question is not clear-cut, so I'm going to talk through the different options given. From the Family Resources Survey, which is data from the Department for Work and Pensions, the percentage of children who are disabled has gone up incrementally from 7% to 9% to 11% chronologically over the past 5 to 8 years. 19.5% refers to over 1.7 million pupils in England who have special educational needs, according to the most recent Department for Education data. 5.3% refers to the number of pupils with education, health and care plans, which is up from 4.8% in 2024. 14.2% refers to the number of pupils receiving SEN support, which is up from 13.6% in 2024. The latest estimates from the Department for Work and Pensions Family Resources Survey indicate that 16.1 million people in the UK had a disability in the 2022 to 23 financial year. This represents 24% of the total population. As we get older, we acquire more things that could amount to a disability. But when we're thinking about children, in the year 2022 to 23, according to that Family Resources Survey, 11% of children in the UK were disabled, and this tends to be the percentage that we go with. So what is the official definition of disability? The definition of disability in the Equality Act is broad. The Equality Act says that a person has a disability if they have a physical or mental impairment, and the impairment has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. We're going to unpick each of these different terms in this definition in the next slide, but this is a really important definition we're going to keep coming back to throughout the training. So let's take a closer look at the key elements in the definition of disability in the Equality Act. Substantial is defined as being more than minor or trivial. The meaning of substantial in the Equality Act is slightly at odds with what it means in everyday use, where we tend to think of it being quite big, for example, a substantial meal. It may be helpful to think of substantial in the Equality Act as being big enough to have substance, hence more than minor or trivial. Long term means something that has lasted or is likely to last for a year or more. In combination, the terms substantial and long term set a relatively low threshold and cover more children than many imagine. When we're looking at day-to-day activities, these are routine activities that children carry out regularly. In the context of early years, normal day-to-day activities would include playing, sitting with other children in a group, singing songs and rhymes, running around, more focused table activities, listening to stories, reading stories, talking about stories, making marks, writing. In fact, anything that a child might ordinarily do as part of their early years experience. As I mentioned previously, the definition of disability in the Equality Act has a broad scope, and many conditions and impairments are included in the definition. A physical or mental impairment may include, but is not limited to, learning difficulties, mental health conditions, medical conditions, neurodivergence or hidden impairments, for example, autism and specific learning difficulties, and speech, language, and communication impairments. A key point is that under the Equality Act, it is the effect of the impairment that matters. In other words, if it has a substantial or long-term effect to carry out day-to-day activities, not whether a child has a diagnosis. It's necessary to highlight that the definition of disability in the Equality Act applies to young children in a couple of ways. The definition applies to young children who have an impairment which has an adverse impact on their ability to carry out day-to-day activities, but also in another specific way. So a child under the age of 6 who has an impairment which does not have a substantial and long-term adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities is included in the definition of disability, where their impairment would have that substantial and long-term adverse effect on the ability of the child over 6 to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So in other words, it's important to understand how that impairment may affect that particular child by the time they got to the age of 6 to consider whether they would be considered disabled under the definition. It's also important to recognise that there are specific inclusions mentioned in the Equality Act. The Equality Act counts some conditions as a disability regardless of the substantial and long-term adverse effect threshold. It names cancer, multiple sclerosis, and HIV as disabilities. The Act requires severe disfigurements to be treated as having an adverse effect on a person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Under regulations made under the Equality Act, people who are certified as blind or partially sighted are also considered to be disabled. We also need to talk about a couple of broader considerations. It's important to note that if a child is receiving treatment for a medical condition, whether they are disabled needs to be considered as if they were not receiving that treatment. In other words, if they weren't receiving treatment, would they meet the substantial and long-term adverse effect threshold? The only exception to the rule of receiving treatment is those who wear glasses. They would not be considered disabled. There may be some children who have a visual impairment who also wear glasses, but it will be the nature of the visual impairment which determines whether they are disabled, not the wearing of the glasses. There may also be particular consideration for recurrent conditions, and these are included when they are likely to recur even though each episode does not necessarily meet the long-term criterion. Some of these may not last 1 year consecutively. For example, some mental health conditions may not last consecutively, but the recurrence would impact on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. When we're thinking about progressive conditions, that is, conditions that get worse over time before the effect is substantial, they're included from the point where they have an adverse effect on the child's ability to carry out those day-to-day activities. Here we have a diagram which shows 3 groups of children: those with special educational needs, those with medical needs, and those who are disabled. It's important to recognise that these are overlapping groups, but these may differ depending on the impairment, special educational need, and medical condition. Children will have different needs, and they may be part of 1 or 3 of these camps. The Children and Families Act 2014 says a child may have a special educational need and require special educational provision if the child either has a significantly greater difficulty in learning than others of the same age, or they have a disability that prevents or hinders them from using facilities provided for others. The Equality Act applies independently of whether a child has a special educational need. That's really important to remember. Children with medical conditions such as epilepsy, diabetes, or more severe asthma or eczema may meet the definition of disability depending on the effect of these conditions if the child was not receiving medication or treatment. Children with more significant special educational needs, including those who have an education, health and care plan under the Children and Families Act, are more likely to be covered by the Equality Act. This is not because they meet the definition of special educational needs or because they have a plan, but because they're more likely to have an impairment that has a substantial and long-term effect on their ability to carry out their normal day-to-day activities. Children who have a range of medical conditions, such as epilepsy, diabetes, or more severe forms of asthma and eczema, are likely to be covered by the definition of disability, but may not necessarily be identified as having a special educational need. Under the Children and Families Act, schools have responsibilities for children with medical conditions. Schools must make arrangements to support them, and they must have regard to the statutory guidance. In addition to the Children and Families Act, for schools, the Early Years Foundation stage requires all providers to promote the good health of children attending the setting and to have and implement a policy and procedures for administering medicines. This is our first pause and reflect opportunity. Understanding who may count as disabled. In a moment, I'll ask you to pause the recording and take a moment to reflect on these following questions. Why is it important for practitioners to understand who may count as disabled under the Equality Act? What signs might suggest to you that a child could meet the definition? How does your setting gather appropriate information to help you consider whether a child may be disabled? Please pause the recording and take a moment to reflect on the questions. If you're watching with colleagues, please be encouraged to have a discussion. If alone, please note down in a journal or notebook to take away for discussions among your team. So what did you come up with? Why is it so important? What signs did you identify? And what appropriate information might you be gathering? Let's take a look at the next few slides to see if they match some of your reflections. So why is it so important? And why does it matter so much? Settings need to know who's disabled so that at a fundamental level they can avoid discriminatory practice and remove barriers to learning and participation. We go into more detail on discrimination in Unit 2. Settings can then anticipate what may be needed to be put in place to prevent any disadvantage that disabled children may face. It allows them to plan in advance and make reasonable adjustments. We'll go into more detail on reasonable adjustments in Unit 3. And finally, to inform longer-term plans for inclusion, which will result in better outcomes for the disabled children in a setting. And we'll go into more of the data and the research on disabled children in Unit 4. As I mentioned at the beginning of the training, you may not know who is disabled in your setting, and there is no duty on parents or children to disclose a disability. But there are other ways to know. Asking is of course the easiest, but be alert to other ways. For example, observing the child in the setting. The impairment may already be recognised in other circumstances, for example on medical documents, so it's important to be aware of the accompanying information for a child. A parent may communicate that a child has a medical condition or something else, and that parent might mention it to someone in a setting, not necessarily the key worker or the setting manager. In that circumstance, the setting would be deemed to know. If anyone in the setting knows, then everyone is expected to know and to then meet duties. So it's important to facilitate good communication amongst staff and ensure people are aware of these Equality Act duties. When settings and practitioners are asking questions, it's important to ask in such a way as both respects a child's dignity and privacy, as well as encouraging parents to share information. It's important to bear in mind that if parents think that information might be used against their child, for example to keep them out of a setting rather than to support them to be included in the setting, they may be reluctant to share information. Another avenue to consider is the progress check at age 2. This is an important opportunity to share any emerging concerns about a child's development. It's important to consider whether any developmental delay may indicate a special educational need or a disability. You may also have access to information on the 2 to 2.5-year-old review completed by a health visitor. At the end of reception year, the Early Years Foundation Stage Profile provides another opportunity to check learning and development. It can also help in identifying any developmental delay, which in turn should lead to a discussion of whether there may be an underlying, unmet or unidentified special educational need or disability. The child's parent should participate in this review, as well as the 2 to 2.5-year-old review. So how may you have that conversation with parents? Settings should ask questions in the broadest possible terms and ask about any learning difficulties, challenges, disabilities or health conditions. It's all about enabling that trust and communication, reassuring that they're going to use that information for the child's benefit. If you do get it right and you work as a team and put in place a plan for what the parent does at home and what you do in the setting, it will result in more positive outcomes for the child. It's important to recognise that the conversation will be impacted by a range of factors, potentially parents' experiences of the system, or they may be disabled themselves. Your own experiences may influence your approach. You may be disabled or have had experience of navigating the system with your own children. The conversation may not be easy to start with, but coming at it with trust and compassion will make it easier. Always be patient. It's not a one-off conversation. You may not be able to address everything you need to in one meeting, so take your time and don't overload the conversation. Sharing information is a crucial part of meeting the Equality Act duties, so encourage an open and safe space for parents to share important details. Providers will want to make sure that they provide opportunities for parents and disabled children themselves to share information about potential or actual barriers and the sort of adjustments that they may need to be made to remove these barriers. An important part of encouraging the sharing of information will be developing parents' trust that information that they share will be handled sensitively. Such trust is more likely to develop where parents encounter a welcome rather than resistance to their child, a willingness to explore possibilities rather than a refusal to consider them. The parent carer viewpoint. We took these comments directly from parents during a training session on the Equality Act, when we asked them how they would like to be asked or communicated with about their child, and here are some of their responses. It's important to remember that these suggestions are individual, and communication style and content of the conversation will differ depending on the parent. Here's what they said. Ask them what they think. They may have some interesting suggestions. A few conversations may be needed to build that trust. Make sure you carve out time in your busy schedules to have that important conversation. Consider the parents' accessibility needs. Do they need reasonable adjustments to communicate with you? Ask them what the best time is. If they're coming off multiple school runs, morning may be better. Engage in active listening. There are plenty of excellent courses on active listening if you feel it's needed. One parent said that they didn't like being called mum, so put in effort to learn the names of parents. Avoid using jargon and acronyms. Some parents may be too nervous to ask you to explain further. Come prepared in advance with all the relevant documentation. Follow up with the parent, not just once but a few times. Parents are interested to hear your ideas on adjustments. It should be a collaborative discussion. And finally, recognise it may be scary for some parents learning that their child could have a disability or a special educational need, so approach that conversation with compassion. There are some wider considerations to think about. The culture of your setting is going to significantly influence whether families feel comfortable having discussions in this territory. It's important to recognise that parents may not think of their child as being disabled, and may not be aware that because of the nature and impact of their child's impairment, their child is covered by the Equality Act. This makes it all the more important to handle these conversations sensitively. Unfortunately, children have been refused places because information has been used against them when parents have shared, rather than to understand how to include them. Where differences are celebrated, it will result in a welcoming atmosphere for all children and families. We'll explore this more in Ethos and Culture in Unit 4. We're going to go into detail on a case law example that relates to the definition of disability. It shows the importance of understanding the breadth of the definition of disability under the Equality Act. Whilst this case study provided is in relation to an older child at a school, it demonstrates how important it is to have a clear understanding of who may be disabled under the Equality Act, even for those working in an early years context. This case law example gives an insight into knowing that a child has a particular condition or special educational need, but you may not realise that you may actually have duties under the Equality Act as well. This child, who we will call Child P, had ADHD, dyspraxia and communication difficulties. The staff referred to him as a naughty child, rather than a child who needed help to manage learning or needed support. In a claim of disability discrimination relating to Child P, his special educational need was recognised by the school, but they did not think of him as disabled. The tribunal determined that he met the definition of disability and that he had been discriminated against. It was clear that the teachers at the school had a different understanding of the threshold for disability and did not regard Child P as disabled. In their view, that category indicated a greater degree of learning or other difficulty than Child P was affected by. As the class teacher put it, Child P was a mainstream child. A key point here is whether the school knows about a child's impairment or condition, not whether that impairment or condition amounts to a disability under the definition in the Equality Act. Ultimately, that issue is decided by the tribunal. The child was a mainstream child with a disability who should have had adjustments put in place. This further underlines the importance of settings understanding the breadth of the definition. Now we're nearing the end of the unit, let's recap on the key takeaways. The definition of disability is broad, by the nature of it being a substantial and long-term adverse effect on a child's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. It is the effect of the impairment that must be considered, not the impairment in itself. We've addressed that there is an overlap between special educational needs, disability and medical needs, but also children can sit in discrete groups. There is no duty on parents and carers to disclose a child's disability, so it's important that provider staff understand it is their duty to anticipate and prevent any disadvantage. Knowing who may be disabled requires a proactive approach, using all the information available to you. Snippets from parents, carers, early years foundation stage progress checks, observations, and many others. There is no defence that a provider did not know that a child was disabled unless the provider could not have reasonably have known. So be curious and make sure there is a good communication between all staff in your setting, from the receptionist to the cleaner. At the end of every unit, we have a takeaway activity. So here is your first one. For this activity, we'd like you to reflect on open conversations. Think about a conversation you had recently with a parent or carer about their child who required adjustments or changes in the setting. That may have been them disclosing their child has a disability or a challenge with a routine task. Think about, firstly, what went well about the conversation? Did you employ some of the best practice we mentioned in the previous slides? And secondly, would you do anything differently next time? And if so, what might that be? Take those questions away and reflect a bit, and then take it to a colleague to discuss. Are you interested in learning more about the definition of disability in the Equality Act? If so, alongside this training we have developed the Equality Act Guide for Early Years, which is called Disabled Children and the Equality Act 2010, what early years providers need to know and do. It was published with this training in July 2025 by the Council for Disabled Children alongside the Department for Education. It provides detailed information on what early years providers need to know and do in relation to the Equality Act duties. This training has been informed by the guide, and the guide has more detailed information if you wish to explore the topic of disability definition further. The link can be found in the notes.
You've reached the end of this unit. Thank you for taking the time. Understanding these duties under the Equality Act is an important step in making sure disabled children aren't at a disadvantage in the setting. Before you move on, take a few minutes to complete the takeaway activity. It's there to help you think through what this means in your role, what might need to change in the way that things are done. When we get this right for disabled children, it often leads to stronger, more inclusive practice for everyone. Thanks again for joining.